And in theory, we should be live. This
All
is
right,
always
we're on.
like professional streamers have the scene overlays and all of these lovely things, but you guys get me. All right, and I think we should be rolling. So, if you're watching this, this is the IGDA Climate SIG monthly guest highlight series. We are super excited today to have Dr. Ben Abraham join us. Please, somebody say something in chat if you can see this once we're live, and let us know if we need to make any audio adjustments. But let's assume that we are good. Would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself, Ben?
Sure. Thanks, Megan. My name is Ben Abraham. I'm a games and sustainability researcher. Excuse me. We were just chatting before about like what my kind of background is, and I've had a pretty strange kind of route through, my career, I guess. I guess primarily I'm a researcher. I'm an academic. I started as a PhD student back in 2010. I was researching internet communities around video games. In 2009, I started this website called Critical Distance, which provided a service to kind of aggregate all of um, the really interesting critical writing about games that was kind of turning up a lot then. This was kind of pre-Twitter really took off. Um, and that was kind of really exciting, and I was really interested in the sort of potential of games communities and communities online generally, and so I started my PhD studying that. Ended up sprawling into a whole bunch of larger issues around like what is the internet doing to our sense of like responsibility, and things like that. And then I finished in 2015, and I got a job at the University of Technology Sydney doing digital media there as a lecturer. And my at the end of my PhD, I sort of went like, well, I was always interested in climate issues and kind of doing things that help the planet, I guess. And like I was reading people like Bill McKibben and all these sorts of things about the kind of building CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And I'm like, fuck, I got to do something about this, right? Like, what do I do? And my answer was like, well, the other thing that has always been a really big part of my life is games. And so I was like, well, I'm going to do something with games, and I've got to do something about the planet. Like, all right, what's that? What does that look like? And so I started thinking back then, like, okay, well, what does climate change mean for games, and what does the games industry need to do to adapt to like minimize its kind of emissions and its footprint on the planet? And that turned into this book that I wrote and had published earlier this year called Digital Games After Climate Change. So yeah, and I actually left the university job in 2020 and was like, you know what, I'm kind of done with working for universities, and now I'm just kind of like a free agent doing a bit of research here and there, doing a little bit of consulting for kind of some games companies and industry groups, and yeah, just looking to kind of push in the right directions with all the stuff I found out now.
I feel like you're living the dream of most of the members of the Climate SIG. Like, I feel envy listening to your description. Um, but we've all been super excited for the launch of your book. Can you tell us a little bit more about it and the reception it's received so far?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, like I mean, I feel incredibly lucky to have gotten to had the opportunity basically to work on it, because it took basically 6-7 years of not quite full time work, but like part time, and then the last year was pretty intense. Yeah, so the book is called Digital Games After Climate Change. It's my attempt to do as much as I can to fill out the picture of what needs to happen, I guess. And that means like, okay, where should we be focusing our time and effort? What is the emissions picture like now? where are those emissions happening, and what sort of strategies can we use to reduce them? And yeah, that kind of, yeah, it's a long book. It's about 100,000 words. So it's, yeah, it was a lot of work, and I'm really pleased actually that it's getting a quite a warm reception. Lots of people are quite interested in the things I have to say there, and saying nice things about it. So yeah, it's finding the people I think that are interested in this topic. It's finding a lot of people inside the industry who have had these sorts of questions, who maybe haven't been able to answer them just because of the, you know, the nature of these sorts of questions is that they are so big and sprawling and interconnected, and like different things kind of change how you view the answer. So like, you know, if even a simple question like what is the most climate friendly mode of playing a game or making a game in, will depend hugely on maybe like 5-10 different variables, like you know, the size of the game that you're making, the length of the game, where in the world your players are, where you are in the world. All of these things just kind of like shift the balance of like, what do we do?
Yeah.
So it's, yeah, it's complicated and hard, and I think people are appreciating the some of the simpler answers I think that I can give in the book, which I try to keep like the real long-term project in mind, which is like full decarbonization. What does that look like? What do we have to do?
Yeah. And it, like all of this is it's a complex, wicked problem that
Mm,
if you can't explain it simply, like it gets hard. And so you are
yeah.
not only handling the complexity of academia and those research questions, but also the games industry where we're, yeah. So one of the main points of the book, from our understanding, is like you're calculating the entire game industry's collective carbon footprint. So what are some of the implications of this metric, and what do you think? What sort of change could this unlock?
Yeah, good question.
It's not mine fully. Like
Yeah.
Hugo is the one. We are so sorry that Hugo's not here because he's the one who is like I am using his words. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, and shout out to Hugo too.
Yeah.
He's been like, he's a total inspiration. When I first started like working on this project, he was like the only other person that I could find who even really publicly kind of said anything or begun thinking about it. So like props to him for being so ahead of the curve
Mm-hmm.
and just like an incredible leader in this space. So um, yeah, so what are the implications of the findings? Well, God,
No
it,
pressure.
yeah, I mean, maybe the way that I break it down in the book to try and keep things manageable is that I, I introduce a way of kind of splitting up the emissions into different phases of the game production process. So I start with kind of game developers themselves, because I think they're so important in this question of, you know, what do we do? So I looked at the emissions of game making as a kind of business activity, and I did a bunch of surveys, and I talked to game developers, and I pulled some data out of the bigger companies that are reporting on this information. So companies like Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, EA, Rovio in
Mm-hmm.
Europe. A lot of these companies, Ubisoft too, big companies now have a responsibility to kind of disclose a lot of this information. And it comes out in these things called corporate social responsibility reports. So I was digging through them, finding like what are they planning to do, what have they already done to kind of calculate and reduce their emissions. So pulled all that together, and yeah, the numbers are pretty big. It's not a small challenge ahead of us, but I think it's one we can address at least there. So the number that I came up with for basically an estimate of the emissions of the industry in 2020 was somewhere between 3 and 15 million tons of CO2 per annum just from making games. And that's just from like, you know, having offices, having servers in your office, having workstations, having heating and cooling, maybe having company cars or having, business trips overseas, all those sorts of things. It's all kind of adding up to this somewhere in that range. And like some of those emissions are really hard.
Yeah.
So business flights, we don't have emissions-free planes yet. And that's like maybe decades away. So that's really tough. The only real kind of solution there is to like try not to fly. With other parts of the business, it's a little bit easier because we have, renewables, and that's like renewable power is the closest thing we have to a silver bullet because it's just free power. Once you've built it, you just keep getting it. Solar panels usually have a lifetime of 25 years. Wind farms, 10 to 15. And then they need to be like recertified and stuff. But you can usually keep running them for like a really long time. And the fuel costs are nothing. Transmission costs are pretty minimal. And the emissions are zero. So if we can swap over to 100% renewables to make games, instantly overnight, basically, we massively bring that number down to, something much more like where it needs to be. In other parts of the industry, the answers look a little bit different, but again, they almost always come back to the idea of renewables and electrification, and what we can kind of do maybe to reduce the consumption of energy until we get to that point where we're at 100% renewables. Because at that point, it's like, okay, who cares? Use as much power as you want because we've got it all free. Which is sort of a strange position to be in, but that's like, maybe a decade or more away for most parts of the world. So until then, yeah, things that we can do like reduce energy consumption, reduce natural resource inputs, lower the amount of new hardware that we have to buy, all sorts of things like that.
Yeah, we have
So
a
there are
question.
some really practical things.
We have a question in chat,
Yeah.
but what about the rare materials to build the panels and stuff like that?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, undeniably there are costs too in like, getting high grade silicon, for instance. Like that's a real challenge for solar panels. But those are the kind of things I feel better about, mining those things than I do, drilling oil and coal and stuff out of the ground, because at least there it's like a kind of one-off cost almost. And to some point, like, I think it's important for us as like activists and people who want to see change to be at least a little bit realistic about things too. Like we are not going to completely do away with the process of mining, right? Like that's just not going to happen. At least not in any like time frame where we actually make a difference to the planet, right? Like, I mean, I'm all for revolution and a throw off the shackles of capitalism and let's move to a post-capitalist utopia, low resource intensity, stuff like that. But until we get to a point where that's even like a remote possibility, we need to kind of work, I think, within the systems that we have. And so, yeah, like a theme that I keep coming back to in my work time and again is like harm minimization. Like, how do we do the least harm in a bunch of different areas? So, yeah.
So, in the book, you brought up a point where game studios is a place where some of the quickest decarbonization wins are to be had in our industry, like you just talked about. But beyond that, when you mentioned that, like, what are some of the... Okay, so if I'm a developer watching this right now, what are some of the simple things that I could be nudging my studio to do? Like, how do I get this conversation going in my workplace?
So I think there's two parts to that question. There's like, what is the goal, and then what is the strategy to get to that goal. The goal actually is fairly simple. It's renewable power. That's the number one thing. And then maybe there are smaller goals around like waste. and things like that. But the main one, the main emissions from most game development is going to be from power, electricity. So how do we make that change? Well, for some developers, if you have a boss that is kind of receptive to these ideas, maybe just ask them, be like, hey, can we buy renewable power? And if they are like you, if they live on Earth and they read the news too, maybe they have an incentive as well to do something about it. So if that's the case, then great, we could really quickly make that change. If they're less receptive to that, then yeah, we might need some other strategies.
I think that gets
Couple of
tricky though.
yeah,
Like
sorry.
if you're just saying like if I'm boss lady, I might not even know what to do to make that happen.
Hmm.
Would you argue is that sometimes a challenge or?
Yeah, I think it is, and I think it's a challenge, particularly for smaller studios,
Yeah.
where you might not have the resources of, say, like a corporate company like EA or Microsoft or something, right? Big companies can employ someone as a a sustainability expert or whatever. It can tell you what to do, or provide like a report on here's our emissions and here's how we buy. Large companies can even do things where you get a power agreement. You go to a solar farm and be like, hey, we want to buy X amount of power because we know we use this much every month. Can we pay you to do that? And usually they'll be like, yes, you can. Here it is. It's nice and cheap. It can be cheaper than buying at wholesale. But yeah, I think the challenge for the industry at the moment is like the small, medium-sized companies and getting the information out to them about what do you do? How do you move your company electricity bill from one provider to another? I mean, in some parts of the world, that's not even possible. You just have one utility, right?
Yeah.
Australia, we have a very privatized energy system, for better and worse. Like, it means we have a choice. We can pay a little bit more to a different company and they'll allegedly buy renewable power and offset the rest of it. It's not particularly transparent sometimes, but yeah, at least we have a kind of an option. Yeah, so maybe part of the work that needs to happen is studio employees who really care about this sort of thing find out what the options are in your area. Just do a little bit of research and Googling and then talk to your boss and present the options. And if you can do that as a group too, I think that gives you a bit of like, collective power, whether it's in a union or if it's just as a few of you that are concerned, that can often be, a good way of, I guess pushing a little bit against those points of resistance.
Yeah. And so, kind of on the point that we had about rare materials, a lot of gaming's footprint, not just climate, but also social and environmental, it comes from manufacturing of new computing devices. I mean, we've seen this iteration for decades, but the solutions are pretty far off, and they can be kind of difficult to imagine. So, crazy question, but what would it mean for the game industry to end this stream of new devices or even become circular?
Yeah. That's kind of the $1 million question, and that's sort of, I think, where the industry is not prepared yet to even really start thinking this. Like, in the other parts of maybe the production cycle, things are a little bit easier. There are kind of already existing solutions in place that you can kind of pick up and adapt, and so renewables, digital distribution, low energy hardware, things like that. But making things, anytime you actually make something, it's almost always going to be really energy intense. And computing devices with like tiny little nano transistors that we lay down with these like hugely energy intense chemical and other processes, like they're some of the most energy intense things that we make on Earth. And the answers, I guess, are going to be multiple. So one of them is like probably, I think, something along the lines of right to repair.
Mm-hmm.
So making devices kind of last longer, making them more amenable to repair at the moment. If I think the latest generation of consoles in particular are pretty okay. Like they've gotten a little bit better, but the PS4 in particular, that's the one I know best because it's kind of what I looked at in the book. But its main CPU GPU chip was soldered directly onto the board with what's called a ball grid array type of soldering, and that's like tiny little dots of solder. And if you need to replace that chip because something fails in it, or if it overheats and melts or whatever, you couldn't do that.
Wow.
Even though like these days, like you can buy one of them for like $30, but if it fails, it's unreplaceable. Basically, you have to swap out the entire logic board that it's attached to, which is a lot more expensive and wastes a lot more components and things like that. So I think a bit more modular design is another approach that kind of helps with this. And there's some interesting stuff happening in the kind of laptop space. There's a computer called the Framework computer. I
Yeah,
don't know
I
if you've
saw that, but
seen that.
did it get delayed, or is it out?
I think that it's got like stages or
Okay.
phases, and part of what it does, I think, is it just gives you a framework, and then you can slot different
Yeah.
bits and pieces in. And so that's kind of like the ideal, right? Like, so if you want to upgrade a little bit of it, you can just upgrade it. It's not like my laptop or my phone where often to keep the cost down, they solder things straight on the board. And, if you want to upgrade your hard drive, it's like, good luck, you're not going to. It's just stuck in there. So yeah, I think those are good approaches to minimizing those sort of the new devices. And then like lastly as well, it's like changing the kind of focus we have in games and the way that we market and sell games. Basically, for the longest time, the industry has sold new games by saying, okay, the graphics are better than last year's one, right? And I think that just kind of feeds into this idea of, needing the newest, the latest, the best, the fastest, the most pixels. And I'm very interested in what kind of sensible limits we can put on some of that upgrade path. So I just wrote recently in my newsletter about why I think the 8K screens, I just don't think they're ever going to make sense. I think 4K is already above the limit where we can kind of see, we can, I guess the literature calls it resolve individual pixels or the pixel structure. So anything above that, it's just like you're just wasting energy and wasting, your potential. So yeah, other things like that, I don't know. I think they're gonna have to come up. We're gonna have to come up with a few interesting things in the next decade or so.
Paula is arguing, but maybe we need 16K. I'm going to ignore that. I don't know if I'm interpreting that comment right. But Felix said, do we need to keep making devices to achieve equitable access to the internet? Or do we feel like there's enough systems out there? Or is there an equity argument to be had?
Yeah, I think equity is a really important perspective on this. In all of these sorts of issues. And again, I think kind of like access to food and good food and things, it's not, the challenge isn't producing enough, it's distributing it fairly, right? And that's, again, that comes back to the kind of inequity and unfairness built into kind of the capitalist mode of production and the way that, histories of like, I don't know, like oppression and enslavement of people, bake in these like inequalities. And so we have enough devices, right? Like the amount of like e-waste that we throw out every year in Western countries is massive. And a lot of it is still working. It's just slightly older, right? If we could repurpose some of that stuff, yeah, we could solve a lot of, I think, those sort of equity issues. I don't know. I'm not hugely across the, there would be some calculations you'd need to do, and I'm sure like there's other considerations that come up. But I think, yeah, a big part of achieving equitable outcomes is actually just, using what we have better. And yeah, I think the systems that we have at the moment, the economies the way we've structured our economies it's not working for that goal. Yeah.
Yeah, and Paula, there's a nice conversation. Felix is arguing it's not like we're talking about pumping out more PS5 for equity, but phones or computers. And Paula, like, planned obsolescence. I hope that doesn't stay a thing. I feel like we all feel like if we
Yeah.
could get back to more of a culture of repairability, like Paula said, but I think there's some really interesting arguments to be made that, at least in the US and in Western countries, where we prioritize innovation over maintenance. So it's going to be a massive shift to try to get back to maintenance.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think it has to get there at some point.
Yeah. Yeah. And companies, I think, are going to resist it too.
Yeah.
We need to be prepared for
Yeah.
the potential resistance. The arguments that they're going to make are that it will damage their bottom line.
Yeah.
And frankly, it probably will.
Yeah.
But that shouldn't stop us, right?
But
like if we know what we need to do.
Dr. Abraham.
I mean, like there will need to be ways that we can say, okay, yes, this is going to impact your bottom line, but we just don't, that's not our problem. That's your problem. Solve that problem for yourself. And right to repair, and the way that that's kind of starting to gain momentum in the US is really exciting.
Yeah.
The way Apple are some of the worst at planned obsolescence, and they are finally coming to the table a bit with these repair guides and manuals, and the willingness to sell parts to individual consumers. Like it's not huge, but it's not nothing either. It's like the beginnings maybe of something better.
I think it's huge. But I've also, like, my personal background, I did a lot with different B Corps who believe strongly in the triple bottom line. So I feel like that argument of this is bad for the, like, if you think about the bigger picture, whatever. Okay, so another one of Hugo's beautiful insights is that this book features some refreshingly radical visions of what a carbon neutral, he said, dare I say, solar punk games industry, what might look like, unshackled from capitalism. But can you talk about some of those, and do you see any seeds for a post-capitalist development structure or culture?
Yeah, gosh. I mean, the seeds are definitely there. I think all you have to do really is look at the way that developers actually love helping each other, I think. The kind of positive sharing of things. And that's a really big part of Australian game development too, actually. Over the last... I just published a paper, actually, with a colleague of mine, Brendan Keogh, from the Queensland University of Technology, about the Australian games industry. And it's kind of the framework of it is Brendan's research was about what does the Australian industry look like today, and he talked to a bunch of game developers and game students as well, and game educators, people who like train students in making games, and Brendan has the best kind of sense of like what the Australian industry looks like, I think, of anyone in Australia. And his research is basically like, well, it's shifted from this 2008, we had pre the GFC, we had a really weak Australian dollar, which meant that our labor costs were low. So lots of studios were operating in Australia and producing games on contract for publishers overseas. When the Australian dollar rose too high, that suddenly became impossible, and a lot of those companies crashed, and the industry basically bottomed out. And since then, it's been kind of rebuilding as this sort of small-scale mostly smaller studios, maybe a couple of larger ones in a few places. But the attitude amongst developers is much more like, I don't exactly want to use the phrase like hustle culture, but it's a bit more like, it's like they're scrappy, they're like the underdogs. Everyone's kind of like, it's not a competitive environment as much as it was before when it was these big studios competing for these big contracts. It's now like, you're making maybe like a narrative game about, I don't know, some coffee shop with a mystical element or something, and then someone else is making one about like a dating sim, and it's like you're not competing for the same audience, so like you can kind of help each other a lot more. And the kind of collaborative dimensions of the industry is like, yeah, it's a really encouraging sign. In terms of what the kind of out there future games industry is that looks like, well, I don't know. Like there are a few little, I like get little glimpses sometimes. Like I imagine that it's like, I mean, one of the things that I want to see is like a shift away from like the graphics intense kind of game development mode to, I guess, kind of, we're already seeing it in the indie space really, is like this sort of like style over photorealism stuff, because that, as soon as you're doing that, you're not going to sell new PlayStation 5s with like, I don't know, cell shaded graphics or something, right? Like that's not, you could play that game probably on like the PS4 and it would be just as nice. Yeah, I don't know. There's all sorts of little weird things. I take a lot of inspiration from like the demo scene space, like in the way that they really prioritize like doing things incredibly with like tiny like hardware constraints, like resource budgets. I think that might be a cool direction for the industry to go into. Obviously, like that, yeah, none of these things are gonna like be the whole answer. Like they're not the be all and end all, but like I think they're little bits and pieces, they're little clues of ways we could approach the problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and all of a sudden we're seeing more and more players gravitate towards less competitive and more collaborative pro-social games that don't require that graphic fidelity.
Yeah, for sure. And that's part of like a larger shift, I think, too, in terms of like what sort of function games are providing in people's lives. Games are, yeah, the place we just hang out now. I play a lot of Destiny 2, and I mean, that game is still running on an engine that basically came out in 2014 or something, I think. The 14? No, 2017. So it's like, I don't know, 5 years old or something. And it still looks good, but it's definitely like, yeah, it's not like a, Infinity Ward 60 frames per second, buttery smooth, like 1440K, all of that kind of stuff. It's just like, it's got different priorities now. It's like about narrative and story, and I really enjoy the kind of social aspect of hanging out in Destiny every evening and, chatting with my clanmates and stuff like that. So, and I don't need Destiny to look like a million times better. I think it looks great. Yeah.
And there was a really good, I don't remember if it was Simon Carles or Joost Van Drunen recently, who are two lovely people in the market research space. But one of them was talking about like most of the games near the top of the charts within the past so many years are old titles. Like you still have Minecraft, you still have World of Warcraft, you still have this is what people keep going back to. I mean, you still have, like, within the past week, we've seen V Rising come up out of nowhere, and we've seen Fall Guys, and we've seen Among Us, and all of these things I've tended to put. But the like mainstays are Destiny 2, and I don't know, that gives me hope that like if you have the social pull, like we could pull people towards the lower graphical potential.
Yeah, and I think it just also reflects a kind of shift in what most game players don't care as much about graphics now. And we have reached a point of kind of diminishing returns too. So I think part of it is just like, I don't know, how many more pixels do you need? How much more particle effects do you need? how many more triangles do you need to make your your circle look like a circle? It's like, it's close enough. That'll do.
Yeah.
And if the alternative is continuing this like unrelenting upgrade cycle of, newer and more powerful hardware and stuff, like, yeah, we'll need to kind of keep making devices because, stuff doesn't last forever. It will break. But I think shifting the emphasis in hardware is really important. And one of the things I'm trying to do at the moment is kind of get along to there's a European Union agreement that it's made with Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo, the games hardware manufacturers. And it's basically just like a piece of self-regulation, a little process for them to kind of get the industry together and say, okay, what can we agree on to reduce the energy intensity of kind of devices? Because the European Union gets that this is really important for a number of reasons. Number one, to reduce kind of emissions, but also just because like inefficient devices cost consumers, like we got to pay for that electricity. It's not free. Well, not yet. Maybe it will be one day, but close to. That's the goal with renewables. Yeah, and so I want that agreement to be as robust as possible. And if I can get along to that, which I'm kind of pushing a little bit to try and get there, I want to ask the manufacturers, like, hey, like, what can we do to have a bit more ambition? Because at the moment, it's got a good focus on like energy efficiency in standby modes and media playback, but there's nothing in there about like when you're actually playing games. There's nothing to limit the creation of a new games console that uses like 2 kilowatts of power. This like ultimate extreme number. Like obviously they'd never do that because you wouldn't need that much, but there is some legislation in California that limits the amount of power a computational device can use over a year, in average conditions. And I think that actually caught out a few manufacturers in 2020 or 2021. Yeah, last year, I think. And a few of them couldn't. Yeah. I think Alienware couldn't sell a couple of their most powerful computers there because it was just not efficient enough. You got like extreme performance, yes, but it was going to cost too much in power and energy, so they actually couldn't meet the legal regulations there. So I think something in that vein, maybe not necessarily exactly that model, but something like it could be important to the future of the industry and bringing down those kind of overall hardware numbers. Yeah.
Paul's got a question. Paul's got like lots of questions. What would you, and we talked about this a little bit, but what would you ideally want developers to strive for from an energy efficiency perspective, and what does good look like?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. And I don't know. I kind of balk a little bit at answering that because I'm not a developer myself. And one of the things that I want to try and emphasize in my work is that you can have an energy efficient game, you can have a sustainable game without changing what the game is about in a way, right? Like it's, to me, the more important thing are the underlying systems powering your development, powering your players' energy, and that you use to kind of like get your games to end users. So yeah, what can developers do? I mean, there are some kind of interesting things that you could do around experimenting with like low computing intensity in your games. Like you could make it like really simple games, but I kind of shy away from that a little bit because I feel like that could take up a lot of time and effort that we could maybe better use elsewhere. So I think the main thing is really like get fossil fuels out of your production process. Figure out where they are. Figure out how you get rid of them, basically. And what does good look like? Well, it's like all renewables, all the time, basically. And then like make whatever games you want, you know, like if you want to make really like kind of climate focused games, great, go for it. If you want to make like the next Call of Duty, if you can do that sustainably without involving fossil fuels, like more power to you, you know, go do it. The game industry is broad and there's room for plenty of it. The unifying factor is needing to decarbonize. So yeah, what that looks like, I guess it's going to depend a little bit on where you are in the world and yeah, what kind of resources you have access to.
Sometimes I like to feel better because, you look back sometimes and you think, all right, people used to believe in humors and leeches and crazy stuff. And I have
Yeah.
hope for the future when they look back and they're like, what were those insane people doing? Making
Mm,
everything with plastic. Like, what
yeah.
was,
Yeah.
what, how was this a norm?
Mm.
So sorry, Paul.
And a lot of effort went into making plastics
Right.
seem normal, right? Like
Yes, there's
we know
so
the
a lot of
history of it.
marketers.
If you're interested in a really, really, really good kind of climate book with the kind of history of how a lot of these systems got started, Jeff Sparrow's book called Climate Heating. Hang on, let me look up the
Crimes
proper
against
title of it.
nature.
But Crimes Against Nature. Yeah, that's it. It's really, really readable, very like kind of approachable, and he kind of digs out these histories of like, okay, what happened when we first introduced plastics? And the case was people reused them. People didn't want to throw away plastics to begin with. They're like, okay, this is a valuable thing, you know,
Mm-hmm.
this is useful. They'd use it like a cloth bag now. And it took a lot of like concerted effort creating this culture of disposability. So that tells us something. It tells us that we're not innately like this wasteful species, right? Like
Yeah.
it's been pushed upon us, these kind of attitudes. And it also tells us that we're going to have to do a lot of work to get to unlearn those and to kind of push back to a more sustainable one. So, but yeah, I'm also really hopeful. We just had a federal election here in
Yeah.
Australia, and
That
we
was
had the
exciting.
best result we've ever had.
Yeah.
I'm so excited about what the next 3 years of our government can do because they've committed to strongish reduction targets. We've got a bunch of independent candidates who ran on a kind of very pro climate action platform. I think they're going to have to be listened to in Parliament. And my own kind of favourites, the Green Party in Australia, won a bunch of new seats in areas they've never won before. It's yeah, it's incredible. I'm more hopeful and optimistic about the future in this country anyway than I have been in in fucking decades. It's
Don't get me started. uh,
I mean I know
yeah.
it's yeah, but it's possible. It's
Yeah.
possible, right? Like, and what is particularly exciting to me is the way that these parties did it, right? Like the way that the Greens organized in their community, right? Like they did the work. They turned up, they door knocked, they talked to people, they found out what people cared about, and then they said, all right, we're going to try and do something about that. And that's like a vote winner. It's not super complicated. It's just like bread and butter, like socialist organizing, community organizing work. If you're not of that particular political persuasion, and it works. It delivers. People can actually, people want change. People. One of the things at the campaign, this guy in Brisbane, Max Chandler Mayer, who is super super inspiring, said is like one of the biggest barriers was the low expectations. People have been so trained to expect that like politicians can't deliver
Mm.
for the public. They're just always beholden to lobbyists or whatever. And he's like, well, that's once we're over that barrier, people start to go, oh, actually, we can change things. We can have a better life. We can make a fairer economy. Okay, all right, great. I'll vote for that.
Yeah.
And then like things change. So yeah.
Okay. You
It's
also.
great. I'm so excited. It's infectious, I think.
That is awesome. And so you spent a few chapters arguing against like the current academic discourse about games' ability to change hearts and minds. Instead, you're advocating for developers to make physical changes to the world by decarbonizing before trying to vastly affect player behavior. Can you talk a little
Mm.
bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, that's where the book begins, really, because I think a lot of game developers who come to this question of like, what can we do for the planet? Um, their first reaction will be, I should make a game about it, you know,
Mm.
and that's 100% understandable. I totally get that. And to some extent, yeah, like by all means, go do that.
You're not
Um,
anti-game.
I'm not anti-game. I love games. Games are great. But I think from a kind of strategic point of view, and from a kind of sober assessment of like what does the challenge before us actually demand,
Mm.
it's not making games, it's decarbonizing the industry. Hugo is totally right when he says like people are going to make climate change games, like they're
Mm-hmm.
just going to. That's just what happens. Game developers make what they know, like, you know, writers write what they know. So I'm not at all saying like that needs to stop or anything. I'm just saying that, and part of why I'm kind of making this argument is that there has been, at least in the academic discourse around games, this understandable tendency to want to say that like games have these incredible powers for like persuasion and changing people's minds, because we know like somewhat intuitively we've probably all had some kind of experience with a game that has been I don't know, changed us in some way, you know, whatever that is. It's kind of made us true believers, right? Like there's a lot of people in the games industry like that. And that's absolutely the case, but I just look at all the research about how people change their minds, particularly around climate, and I look at the things like the ideological barriers to converting like a climate skeptic into like a believer, and it's like the ways that we do those things are not, they're way more complicated, I think, than games can manage. All the best kind of climate communication research says that any piece of communication about climate needs to meet people basically where they're at. It needs to make sense for them in terms of their kind of social world and their understanding of things. So like if you put on Al Gore's, you know, An Inconvenient Truth in a, you know, you go to a deeply conservative part of the US or something and you screen it at a church or whatever, like that's not going to make any fucking sense to them, right? Like they're just going to be like, these fucking liberal city elites, what do they know, you know? And to an extent, they're right about that, you know, because Al Gore is not speaking to those people. He's speaking to like us. He's speaking to, you know, people who kind of already get it and just, you know, needed a bit of a push in the right direction or whatever. Those people, I mean, and I don't even really want to be like an us versus them
Yeah.
thing, because I think people everywhere are more diverse than just that. But it's it it behooves us to take seriously the people on the other end of our games, right? And to know them and communicate to them in a way that makes sense for them and that they are willing to receive, right? And so making games in that way, I don't know how you do that. I
No.
have no idea. If someone has an idea, by all means, have a go. But yeah, the more urgent task, I think, is making material changes to the way that we make games, because at that point, like once we've done that, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what other people think, right? Because we've solved the problem. We have changed the world for the better, and we didn't even need them. We don't have to. Yeah, it's great if we can bring people along with us, but at a certain point, like if we don't need them, we don't need them.
We
So
have some interesting conversation going on from Niv, who was arguing, you mentioned people are culturally conditioned to use plastic as disposable. Why isn't this, why isn't, if culture was used to make us a throwaway culture, then culture is part of the solutions for all of the things. But I think we all are on the same page that We need all of it. We need the material
Mm,
decarbonization. We also need more conversations. And I think Hugo is a bit like many of us in the climate special interest group, which, if anybody is new to the stream, this is we're part of the International Game Developers Association, and we are a group that we are all trying to find a way to mitigate climate change. How do we make, like you said, harm minimization?
mm,
So, making sure that, are we making sure we're not barking up the wrong tree here? Because a lot of the people in the special interest group are very invested in how art and games and media can affect societies and individuals. So you have a
mm.
rogue take, but I think we all
I
need to
know,
do all
yeah.
the things.
Yeah. And I guess partly one of the reasons I make the argument too is that I'm just so aware of like the
Hmm.
time, right? Like
Yeah.
we have only so much time left. And I wish we could do all of the things. And to an extent, yeah, we need to try everything. But the things that we've tried already, I think if we're not learning from um, past kind of experience and research, then we're not doing ourselves or the challenge justice. But I really like the I've only had a little quick skim of it, but the actions wiki
Hmm.
thing, the design playbook, I think it's fantastic, and I think that that's exactly the kind of resource we need, particularly because it starts with this series of change and how you actually ground that. I mean, and that even just that is missing from so much of like, it's not as prevalent anymore, but like the kind of academic discourse around games for change and stuff like that was very simplistic, and there was never any idea of like how do people actually receive these games and receive these messages. It was like, oh, we can make a game that like puts people in the position of an oil baron, and they can see here are the consequences of being an oil baron. Oh, maybe I won't do that. It's like, that's not how it works. People, I mean, Ian Bogost in 2007, in his book Persuasive Games, has this concept in it called simulation fever, where people talks about people playing the simulation and then going like, that's not how it works, and they have a mental model of how the world is, and then they play the game and it doesn't match. And I read that concept and I go, well, that's exactly what's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Like when people engage with a vision of the climate or an argument about what should be done, or what is being done, and go, no, I don't agree, and then they'll just like shut off or whatever. So yeah, that's like what, 2017, 2007. It's like 13, 15 years ago now. Like, that's not new. We've been having this debate, at least in the academic kind of games sphere, for as long as I've been aware of it. And this was, yeah, that particularly that chapter 2 intervention is like my attempt to be like, look, we've just got to stop wasting our time.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, is a tendency. Another really good, like maybe the best take on the serious games, persuasive games thing is from Paolo Pedicini, when he gave a keynote address at one of these serious conferences and talked about his perspective on it. And he's like an incredible game maker, right? And makes some incredible games. And he has a very like strong argument, again, also against like this naive approach to persuading people through games. So that's definitely worth looking up as well. I forget what the title of it was, but it was like some kind of keynote. Maybe it was just called Against Persuasion or something. I forget. But yeah, really, really good. Really, really interesting talk, and really like theoretically grounded. Because that guy is like, he's a smart cookie, right?
Yeah.
He reads the Italian Marxist autonomists and stuff, and he's like, this is what we should do. Yeah.
We had a question about blockchain and the hopes that the promise of zero emissions in that future is at all possible. So I referenced, we just talked with Dr. Catherine Flick in April about blockchain and the implications right now, especially if I'm a game developer considering NFTs in my game. Do you have any thoughts on? I we've got resources for this, but if you'd like to add anything,
Mm.
welcome to.
I guess my only kind of input into that debate is, again, that a harm minimization approach is needed. It's whatever I say is not going to change, like these big companies that have set their mind on doing NFT stuff. It's just going to have to play itself out. They're going to have to try it, fail, fail to make any money, or fail to make anything that's like particularly novel, and learn from that, I think, themselves, because that's, they're not going to listen to me.
Yeah.
But in terms of if they are going to listen to anything, maybe it's a harm minimization argument.
Yeah.
You know, look at which blockchains, which chains are the lowest emissions intense. Be critical about the claims they make around that. Particularly the ones that say, oh yeah, you know, we're only a little bit emissions and then we offset everything. Well, look into those offsets. Make sure that they're legitimate. You know, there are lots of problems with the offset market. I wrote a little comment in the SIG yesterday with some of the stories and resources that I've come across about offsetting and the problems with the offsetting market.
Yeah.
And that's why I think, again, I think game developers need to do things that are not just offsetting. It's about reducing the first order emissions. And offsetting should be like a last resort in pretty much every case.
So, what's the next steps for you? And we'll round this out in about 4 or 5 minutes. We'll cap it at about an hour. And really quick, we have so many new people tonight who have come. Thank you. Like, this has been really exciting to have at a different time slot. I'm so sorry to all the Europeans who are asleep who might be watching this, but we have new people, so I don't know.
We got the American, the Australian audience, maybe.
Yeah. And I think we have some different people who might be in Asia and like Southeast, like.
Yeah, cool.
It's great. But
lovely to have you.
This has been phenomenal to have some new voices and reach some different people. But what's next for you? So you've released the book and you've left the academic world, and I'm going to go ahead and put a shout out. Like, if you are watching, definitely check out the newsletter.
So my kind of plan at the moment is like my guiding light, my number one goal is like, I just want to have a big impact, right? Like, I want to prevent millions of tons of CO2 from going into the atmosphere. And if I can do that, then, you know, I can die happy. How I do that, I guess, at the moment is like, I want to work with big and small game companies. I want to help people to come up with, you know, emissions reduction strategies. I want to help developers who are maybe unclear about what are these sort of first steps? How do you find, you know, renewable power? How do you find kind of certified offsets, you know, that are reliable? And I want to I want to change the way that we think about the intersection between games and climate. So I've launched a newsletter that you can subscribe to. Maybe we'll put the link in the chat.
Yeah.
There's like a free subscription tier, and then there's like a paid one too. And I would like to try and keep as much of the important advocacy stuff free as I can, while also having some of the more like kind of businessy analysis stuff maybe behind like a, you know, paywall for people to, if they want to help support the work that I'm doing. And and I'm pretty flexible at the moment in terms of, if people have a project, you want some research done, or you want, I don't know, maybe you want training on how do you calculate your emissions, because there are these like several different standards about how you collect the data and report the data and organize it. Yeah, if you want a hand doing that, or you want me to do that for you, get in touch, and we can kind of talk about what you'd like to have done, and maybe we'll start to get the ball rolling on making this industry a bit more green. Yeah.
And Paula likes your little goal with no pressure. Big shout out. Thank you so much, Dr. Ben Abraham, for joining us and having the spotlight this evening / morning / whatever time it is. Big thanks to Paula and Hugo, two of our co-chairs for the Climate SIG. All of these questions were Hugo's because he's, like we mentioned, he's incredible, and Paula's like we have so many lovely individuals who are helping us all work towards something
Mm.
together.
Yeah,
And
the IGDA Climate SIG is so inspiring. There's so many hardworking people there. Like, just, yeah, it blows me away. So yeah, cheers. Thanks,
Yeah.
and thanks Megan as well for hosting and asking. Hosting such a nice discussion. Yeah.
I like being a liaison and getting smart people. But yeah, so if you're checking this out and you don't know where to get started, if you're a game developer, if you're in the games industry, check out igdaclimatesig.org. You can get to our Discord there, and our Discord is really active. Like, it's a really wonderful, safe place. And we've had other of these doing our bit live streams. We have lots of resources for you. All right. Thank you again so much, everyone, for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.